I am 17, and this was supposed to be the easiest $100 I ever made. My uncle is an architect who built this massive, ultra-modern house out in the deep woods. It is a stark combination of concrete and floor-to-ceiling windows, looking like a glass box. He was flying to Europe for a conference, leaving me to feed his temperamental Siamese cat. My mom dropped me off on a Friday evening, the tires crunching loudly over the long gravel driveway. I dragged my duffel bag into the grand foyer, immediately pulling out my phone to check the bars. Only one bar of cell service, but the house had a mesh Wi-Fi network that supposedly reached everywhere. I locked the heavy oak door behind me, hearing the solid, mechanical thud of the deadbolt sliding home. The quiet in that house was oppressive, the kind of silence that rings in your ears like a heavy static. Double-paned insulated glass meant you could not even hear the wind rustling the tall pines outside. I spent the first few hours just scrolling through my feed, sinking into the massive leather couch. The cat ignored me completely, choosing to sleep on a high shelf in the expansive kitchen. As the sun dipped below the tree line, the aesthetic of the house shifted from airy to deeply unsettling. The glass walls stopped showing the vibrant green forest, turning into massive, flat black mirrors. Every time I looked up from the glow of my screen, I saw my own pale reflection suspended in the dark. I decided to close the automated blinds, tapping the smart home tablet mounted on the living room wall. A soft mechanical whir echoed through the room, but only half of the heavy gray shades lowered. The system threw an error code, a little red triangle blinking stubbornly on the digital display. I sighed, rubbing the bridge of my nose, annoyed that rich people technology never actually works. Leaving the remaining windows exposed, I walked into the kitchen to heat up a bowl of leftover pasta. The microwave hummed its monotonous tune, casting a pale yellow light across the marble island. That was when the motion sensor floodlights in the backyard flicked on, illuminating the tree line. I paused, my thumb hovering over the screen of my phone, watching the stark white light spill across the grass. My uncle had warned me about raccoons and deer wandering out of the woods to dig through the compost. I assumed it was just a stray animal, taking a bite of my food while I waited for the lights to time out. 5 minutes passed, the floodlights remained stubbornly bright, casting long shadows against the glass. I felt a strange tightness in my lower stomach, a dull ache that made me slowly put my fork down. Rational people do not panic over motion lights, so I grabbed my phone and typed a text to my mom. Just a quick message saying the animals were tripping the sensors, but the message failed to send. The tiny loading circle spun uselessly at the top of my screen, mocking my lack of connectivity. I glanced at the Wi-Fi icon. The little curved bars had vanished, replaced by a harsh slash. No internet, no cell service, just me and a cat in a glowing glass box surrounded by miles of dark woods. The router was located in my uncle's home office, a room attached to the glass-enclosed sunroom at the back. I did not want to go back there, but the thought of spending the whole night offline was unbearable. I walked down the long hallway, my socks sliding quietly over the polished concrete floors. Every step felt uncoordinated, my knees feeling strangely loose and unhinged beneath my sweatpants. The door to the office was open, the blinking green lights of the router visible on the far desk. I walked in and reached for the power cord, planning to do a simple hard reset to fix the glitch. Through the office window, I could see into the adjoining sunroom, lit only by the ambient yard lights. I pulled the plug, trying to keep my breathing slow and measured. I stared out into the glass room, my eyes adjusting to the heavy contrast of shadows. The shadows near the exterior glass door seemed thicker, layered in a way that felt wrong. I plugged the router back in, watching the LED sequence flash yellow, waiting for the green connection light. As the green light popped on, it cast a faint emerald reflection against the glass of the sunroom. The reflection illuminated something standing on the outside of the sunroom door, pressing against the pane. It was a man wearing a dark canvas jacket, holding a pair of heavy industrial wire cutters in his right hand. He was not a ghost, he was not a monster, he was just a desperate, calculating man looking for a target. Burglars look for isolated smart homes, clipping the fiber optic lines to kill the cameras and the alarms. He thought the house was empty, until he saw the soft green glow of the router light up my pale face. My heart began thumping against my ribs, a frantic flutter like a trapped moth trying to escape a jar. We locked eyes through 2 panes of insulated glass, the silence between us feeling heavy and suffocating. He tilted his head, realizing he had made a mistake, but his grip on the heavy metal cutters tightened. He did not run away, his posture shifted, changing from a stealthy trespasser to someone cornering a problem. Leaving a witness behind is not part of the plan, and I was miles away from the nearest neighbor. I backed out of the office, my legs trembling so much I bumped my hip hard against the wooden door frame. I did not scream. Screaming into soundproof glass is useless. I just sprinted toward the main hallway. I heard the sharp, percussive shatter of the sunroom door breaking, the heavy glass cascading onto the tile. He was inside, his heavy boots crushing the broken shards with a slow, methodical crunching sound. I bolted for the front door, my hands slick with sweat as I fumbled with the heavy brass deadbolt. I twisted the lock and yanked the door open, the frigid night air hitting my face like a physical blow. I did not look back. I ran straight into the dark woods, letting the branches tear at my clothes and skin. I hid in the damp underbrush for hours, clutching my useless phone, watching the beam of his flashlight sweep the yard. He finally gave up and drove away in a beat-up truck, leaving the front door hanging open in the wind. The police said he was targeting empty vacation homes, tearing out copper pipes and expensive electronics. They told me I was lucky I got out when I did, because men like that do not like leaving loose ends. I never went back to that house, and I never complained about having my location tracked on my phone again. Whenever the Wi-Fi drops in my own home, I find myself staring at the nearest window, waiting for a face to appear. Have you ever noticed a chair moved just an inch from where you left it and told yourself you were just being forgetful? It is a quiet Tuesday, the kind of night where the silence of a suburban house feels heavy, like a thick wool blanket. I am sitting in my home office, the blue light of my monitor casting long, sharp shadows against the eggshell walls. As a designer, I notice when things are out of alignment, even by a few pixels or a few inches. I stood up to grab a glass of water, my knees popping in the stillness of the midnight air, and I stopped. My favorite coffee mug, the one with the chipped handle, was sitting on the very edge of the kitchen counter. I specifically remember pushing it back toward the toaster, far away from the ledge, yet there it was. I shrugged it off, thinking I must have bumped it when I went to check the mail earlier that evening. The house is old, a rental with settled foundations and floorboards that groan like tired joints under the carpet. I checked the deadbolt on the front door. The cold metal of the lock bit into my thumb, providing a brief sense of security. Back in my office, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly cut out, leaving the air feeling hollow and thin. That is when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic scraping sound coming from beneath the floorboards in the hallway. I did not run, I did not scream, I just sat there, my throat feeling as dry as a desert floor, listening. A rational person knows that old pipes rattle, or that a stray cat might have found a way into the crawl space. But this sound had a weight to it, a slow, deliberate friction that suggested something much larger than a cat. I felt a tingle in my fingertips, a numb, buzzing sensation that made it hard to grip the edge of my desk. I pulled up the feed from my doorbell camera on my phone, the screen glowing with a grainy, gray image. The porch was empty, the streetlights flickering in the distance. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Then the scraping stopped, and the air in the room seemed to grow cold, clinging to my skin like a damp cloth. I realized the sound had not come from the floor. It had come from the vent directly behind my chair. My stomach twisted, a sharp, acidic heat rising into my chest as I slowly turned my head to look at the wall. The metal slats of the vent were slightly bent, a dark, oily smudge marking the white paint of the baseboard. I didn't move, I couldn't move, my vision tunneling until all I could see were those distorted metal bars. From the darkness behind the vent, a pale, unblinking eye stared back at me, fixed and terrifyingly still. It wasn't a monster, it was a man, his face thin and sallow, his skin covered in a layer of gray dust. He didn't look angry, he looked comfortable, like he belonged in the walls of my home more than I did. I backed away, my chair screeching against the hardwood, the sound echoing through the empty house. The man did not flee, he simply retreated further into the shadows, his movements silent and fluid. I scrambled for my keys, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps that hurt my lungs in the freezing air. I didn't look back until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life as I peeled out of the driveway. The police found a sleeping bag, a collection of my discarded mail, and a spare key tucked inside the vent. They never found him. They said he must have slipped out through a loose board in the foundation before they arrived. I moved out the next day, but sometimes, when it's quiet, I still feel like the furniture isn't where I left it. I look at the vents in my new apartment, and I wonder if the shadows are just a little bit darker than they should be. There is a very specific, quiet vulnerability that comes with living in a ground-floor garden apartment. You are eye level with the street, separated from the outside world by only a thin pane of cheap glass. I am 26, I work as an archivist, and I catalog my daily routines with the exact same precision. I like order, I need everything in its proper place before I can finally relax and go to sleep. It was a Thursday night, and the rain was hammering against my bedroom window in a heavy, chaotic rhythm. The sound of a storm usually brings me comfort, acting like a thick blanket of white noise over the city. I was sitting on my bed, indexing a stack of old municipal photographs, enjoying the absolute isolation. The apartment was entirely dark except for the small, focused beam of my bedside reading lamp. As an archivist, I am trained to notice the margins, the small discrepancies that most people overlook when they are skimming through a chronological record. That is why, when I heard a dull, asymmetrical thud from the living room, my brain immediately registered it as an error in the audio track of the storm. It wasn't a sharp break or a loud crash, it was just a heavy, wet shifting sound in the dark. A rational mind tries to correct the error, categorizing the unknown noise into a safe, familiar box. I told myself it was just a heavy branch falling from the old oak tree against the side of the building. But then, after a few agonizing seconds, the heavy shifting sound repeated with distinct purpose. I stopped indexing my photos, the glossy paper slipping from my fingers and landing on the duvet. My jaw muscles clamped down involuntarily, tightening until the roots of my back teeth began to ache. I told myself to breathe, forcing my lungs to expand against the sudden, heavy pressure in my chest. Old buildings have drafty hallways and settling foundations. They make strange noises all the time. Stepping out of the safe perimeter of my bedroom felt like walking into a massive, undocumented void where the rules of my meticulously organized life no longer applied. The hallway was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint, ambient glow of the street lamps filtering through the rain-streaked living room windows at the far end. Normally, the distance between my bedroom and the kitchen is exactly 16 steps, a journey I make daily. But tonight, the geography of my own apartment felt entirely foreign, distorted by the heavy darkness. I crept forward, my toes gliding soundlessly over the polished wood, counting my steps in my head. The floorboards remained silent, my weight perfectly balanced on the solid joists. The smell of damp earth and ozone grew stronger, entirely overpowering the stale air. When I finally reached the end of the hall, I saw the heavy velvet curtains whipping wildly in the wind. Someone had pushed the kitchen window up, leaving the metal latch broken and the glass hanging wide open. I reached out and flicked the wall switch, flooding the room with a harsh, saturated overhead light. There was a puddle of water sitting directly in front of the kitchen sink, dark and muddy. I stared at it, my mind scrambling to categorize the anomaly as a leaking pipe or a drafty windowsill. But water from a leaky pipe drips straight down. It does not take the shape of a massive, heavy boot. The footprint was smeared, the ridges of the sole clearly pressed into the light-colored kitchen floor. My throat closed up. Swallowing suddenly felt like trying to force a dry pill down my swollen esophagus. I realized with a sickening clarity that the storm outside was not hiding the sounds of the city from me. It was hiding the sounds of my own apartment from my completely oblivious ears. The intruder was already standing somewhere inside my home. I did not call out. I did not ask if anyone was out there in the shadows. A drifter seeking shelter wouldn't care if I was home. They just wanted an easy target for quick cash. Desperation makes people entirely unpredictable, and I was terribly vulnerable. I heard a sound from the bathroom, a sticky, peeling noise like a wet rubber sole lifting off the tile. He was less than 15 feet away from me, moving slowly, checking the rooms one by one. A heavy pressure settled at the base of my skull, a primal instinct demanding that I hide immediately. I stepped backward, perfectly placing my feet on the silent margins of the floorboards I knew were safe. I retreated into the narrow, windowless utility closet next to the refrigerator, closing the door gently. The darkness inside the closet was absolute, smelling faintly of bleach and old cardboard boxes. I pulled my phone from my pajama pocket, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it on the floor. I turned the screen brightness all the way down, terrified that the glow would bleed under the closet door. I dialed emergency services, pressing the speaker tight against my ear to muffle the dispatcher's voice. I whispered my address, my lips barely moving, praying the dispatcher could hear my desperate syllables. She told me police were en route, but the rain was causing severe delays all across the city grid. I disconnected the call, holding my breath as I listened to the sounds of my apartment being violated. I could hear his heavy, waterlogged boots dragging across the floor as he moved from the bathroom into the living room, carelessly tossing my neatly organized belongings onto the ground. Every drawer he opened sounded like a gunshot, the wood grinding loudly against the metal tracks. He was searching blindly for cash, jewelry, anything small he could stuff into his wet jacket pockets. Then the haphazard crashing suddenly stopped, leaving nothing but the muffled sound of the pouring rain. The silence was worse than the destruction, because it meant he was actively listening for something. He had noticed the bedside lamp in my bedroom. He knew that someone was inside the apartment with him. I heard his footsteps change direction, slow, deliberate, walking directly toward the kitchen. The sticky, wet peeling of his boots stopped right outside the thin wooden door of my utility closet. He was standing close enough that I could hear his wet clothes dripping onto the linoleum right outside. My heart began slamming violently against my rigid ribcage. I pressed both of my hands flat against the dark plaster wall. I watched in horror as the brass doorknob slowly began to turn. The metal mechanism clicked loudly in the claustrophobic space. I had locked it, but it was a flimsy interior latch. He jiggled the handle, the loose wood rattling loudly in the doorframe. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the door to splinter open. Suddenly, the piercing shriek of police sirens cut through the heavy white noise of the storm outside, their red and blue lights flashing frantically through the living room windows. The man let go of the doorknob instantly, his heavy boots scrambling frantically across the wet floor. I heard him slide through the open kitchen window, his jacket tearing against the broken screen. By the time the police kicked down my front door, the apartment was completely empty and freezing cold. They took my statement, but all they found was a trail of muddy water and a dropped pocket knife on the rug. The officers told me that transient criminals rarely stick around when things get complicated or noisy. They boarded up the window, promised extra patrols, and left me alone with my scattered belongings. I spent the rest of the night scrubbing the kitchen floor, trying to erase the physical evidence of him. But no matter how much bleach I use, I can still smell the sour dampness lingering in the air vents. My apartment is back in perfectly organized order, every book, every photograph in its proper index. But the catalog in my mind is permanently corrupted, ruined by the memory of that wet doorknob turning.